You're 30 seconds into a remote meeting. Your camera's on. Your mic is unmuted. And yet, no one's really listening. You can see it in their eyes. That half-present look. The way their gaze drifts just past the screen. Maybe they're checking email. Maybe they're mentally planning lunch. But one thing is certain. You've lost them. Not because your ideas aren't good. Not because you lack expertise. But because in this strange, digital dimension we now call the office, presence doesn't work the way it used to. Authority doesn't carry over through a webcam the way it does across a boardroom table. And influence? Well, that requires an entirely different playbook. This is the quiet crisis of modern leadership. We've spent decades mastering the art of in-person communication. The handshake, the eye contact, the way you command a room simply by walking into it. And then, almost overnight, all of that became irrelevant, or at least insufficient. Because the leaders who thrived in conference rooms aren't automatically the ones who thrive in Zoom rooms. The skills don't translate one-to-one. The screen flattens everything. It mutes your energy. It turns your body language into a tiny rectangle. And suddenly, the very presence that made you effective before feels like it's evaporated into digital static. But here's what most people get wrong. They think the problem is the medium itself. They blame the technology. Remote meetings just aren't as effective, they say. You can't build real connection through a screen. And sure, there's some truth to that, but it's also a convenient excuse. Because the reality is this. Some leaders have figured it out. Some people show up on camera and immediately command attention. They speak and people lean in. They pause, and the silence feels intentional, not awkward. They ask questions, and suddenly everyone's unmuted and engaged. So what are they doing differently? That's what we're here to explore. Not surface-level tips like make eye contact with the camera or use a good microphone. Though yes, those help. We're going deeper into the psychology of remote presence, into the specific, trainable skills that separate leaders who struggle to hold attention from those who make every word count. Because speaking with authority in a remote meeting isn't about being louder or more charismatic. It's about understanding how human attention works when mediated by screens. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stop. It's about using silence, structure, and strategic questions to pull people in, rather than pushing information at them. And the good news? These skills can be learned, not through some vague advice about executive presence, but through clear, actionable techniques that you can start using in your very next meeting. 4 skills specifically. 4 mental shifts that, once you internalize them, will fundamentally change how people experience you on camera. Not because you've become someone different, but because you've learned to translate your natural authority into a language that works in this new environment. So let's begin. Not with theory, but with the first principle that changes everything. That's the power of the pause. There's a moment that happens in every remote meeting. Someone finishes talking. And immediately, almost reflexively, the next person jumps in. No gap, no breath. Just a seamless handoff of sound, like everyone's terrified of dead air. And in that rush to fill the silence, something crucial gets lost. Not just the space to think, but the weight of what was just said. Because in remote meetings, silence isn't empty. It's powerful. And most people are accidentally giving that power away. Think about the last time you watched a great film. Not an action movie, but something with real emotional depth. Notice what the director does in the most important moments. They let scenes breathe. They hold on a character's face just a beat longer than feels comfortable. They use silence to amplify meaning. And your brain, trained by a lifetime of storytelling, knows exactly what that silence means. This matters. Pay attention. The same principle applies in remote meetings, but with one critical difference. In person, silence is felt physically. You can sense the room holding its breath. On a video call, silence feels different, almost awkward. Because we're not sharing the same physical space, our tolerance for quiet drops dramatically. 3 seconds of silence in a conference room feels natural. 3 seconds of silence on Zoom feels like an eternity. So we rush to fill it. And in doing so, we train people that our words don't require reflection. They're just noise to be processed and moved past. Leaders who speak with authority understand this instinct and deliberately work against it. They don't talk more. They talk less, and they let their words settle. After making an important point, they pause. Not a brief hesitation, but a full, intentional stop. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, long enough that it feels almost uncomfortable. And here's what happens in that space. People's brains catch up. The words you just said get processed at a deeper level. And more importantly, the silence signals to everyone on the call that what you just said wasn't throwaway commentary. It was something worth absorbing. But there's an art to this. Pause too little, and you're just another voice in the chaos. Pause too long, and people think their connection froze. The sweet spot is about 2 to 4 seconds after a key statement, long enough to feel deliberate, not so long that it breaks the flow. And the magic is in consistency. When you make this a pattern, speak, pause, people start to anticipate it. They learn that when you talk, there will be space to process. So they listen more carefully from the start. Here's a practical example. Imagine you're presenting a strategic recommendation. Most people would say something like, I think we should pivot our Q4 strategy to focus on customer retention because our acquisition costs are rising and our churn rate suggests we're not solving the core value proposition problem. One long run-on sentence, no break. And by the end, half the participants are still processing the beginning. Now watch what happens when you build in pauses. I think we should pivot our Q4 strategy. Pause. Let that land. The reason is simple. Our acquisition costs are rising. Another pause. But more importantly, our churn rate tells us something critical. Pause. We're not solving the core value proposition problem yet. Full stop. Silence. See the difference? Same information. Completely different impact. The pauses create natural chapter breaks. They give people time to nod along mentally. They turn a data dump into a story. And most importantly, they position you as someone who doesn't need to rush. Someone confident enough to let their words breathe. But pausing isn't just about emphasis. It's also about creating space for others. One of the most common complaints in remote meetings is that the same few voices dominate while everyone else stays muted. And yes, some of that is personality, but a lot of it is structural. When there's no pause between speakers, it's genuinely hard to find an entry point. You're sitting there, wanting to contribute, but the moment you try to unmute, someone else has already started talking. So you wait, and eventually you just stop trying. Leaders who create space solve this by building pauses into the rhythm of discussion. After asking a question, they don't immediately call on someone. They count to 5 in their head. They let the silence exist. And in that space, something remarkable happens. People start to unmute themselves, not because they're being forced to, but because the silence has created room for them. It's become an invitation rather than a barrier. This requires real discipline, by the way, because everything in your nervous system will be screaming at you to fill that silence. You'll feel the urge to rephrase the question, or to call on someone by name, or to jump in with your own thoughts. Resist it. Trust the pause. Let it do its work. Because the people on your call aren't slow. They're not unengaged. They just need a beat to formulate their thoughts without feeling like they're interrupting. And here's the deeper truth beneath all of this. Pausing signals confidence. It says, I don't need to fill every second with sound. I trust that what I've said is enough. And people respond to that at a subconscious level. They start to perceive you differently, not as someone trying to dominate the conversation, but as someone orchestrating it. Someone who understands that communication isn't about transmitting information as fast as possible. It's about creating the conditions for understanding. So if you take nothing else from this, take this. Slow down. Speak your thought, then stop. Count to 3. Let it breathe. Watch what happens to the quality of the responses you get. Watch what happens to the level of attention you command. Because in a world where everyone's racing to be heard, the person who's comfortable with silence is the one who stands out. The structure beneath the surface. Let's talk about something that most people don't notice until it's pointed out to them. Every compelling speaker, whether they're presenting remotely or in person, is using invisible architecture. You don't see it. You don't hear it explicitly, but your brain feels it. It's the reason some presentations feel effortless to follow. while others leave you confused 10 minutes in, even when the content is identical. This is the second skill that separates average communicators from truly authoritative ones. Structural clarity. And in remote meetings, where attention is already fragmented and people are half watching their inbox, structural clarity isn't just helpful, it's essential. Because when people can't see your face clearly, can't read your body language fully, and can't feel the energy of the room, they need something else to hold on to. They need a framework, a mental map, a sense that you know exactly where this is going, even if they're still figuring it out. Think about the difference between wandering through a city without a map versus following a clear route on your phone. Both might get you to the destination eventually, but one journey feels aimless and stressful. The other feels guided and intentional. The same is true for your words. When you speak without structure, people are expending mental energy just trying to figure out where you're going, and that energy isn't available for actually processing your ideas. But when you provide structure, you free up their cognitive resources. They can relax into listening because they trust that you've got this. So what does structural clarity actually look like in practice? It starts with something deceptively simple. Telling people where you're going, not in an overly formal first I'll cover this, then that way, though sometimes that works too, but in a more natural, narrative way. You create a mini roadmap with your opening statement. Something like, I want to walk through 3 things today. First, what we're seeing in the data. Second, why I think it's happening. And third, what we should do about it. Notice what that does. It doesn't reveal your conclusions yet. It doesn't spoil the journey. But it gives people a sense of progression. They know there are 3 beats. They can mentally prepare for that rhythm. And as you move through each section, they'll instinctively track where they are in the sequence. Okay, we've covered the data. Now we're moving into the why. One more after this. That kind of internal tracking keeps people engaged because they're not lost. They're following a path, but here's where most people stop. They create a high-level outline and think that's enough. What they miss is the deeper layer of structure, the logic that connects each piece. Because it's not enough to just list 3 things. You need to show why those 3 things belong together, why they follow that specific sequence, why understanding the first one unlocks the second one. This is what transforms a presentation from a list into an argument. Let's say you're leading a product strategy meeting. You could say, we need to talk about our feature roadmap, our pricing model, and our go-to-market timeline. Fine, that's 3 topics. But there's no connective tissue. Now listen to this version. Our feature roadmap is driving customer feedback that's forcing us to rethink our pricing model. And both of those decisions are going to impact when we're actually ready for a full market launch. Same topics, completely different feel. The second version shows causality. It reveals how these pieces fit together. And that matters because humans don't just process information. We process relationships between information. We want to understand the why behind the sequence. And when you provide that, you're not just listing agenda items. You're building an argument. You're creating a narrative arc that pulls people through. Now let's go even deeper. Within each section, you want microstructure too. This is where a lot of remote presenters lose people. They'll have a great high-level outline, but then within each topic, they just start talking. Stream of consciousness. One thought triggers another. And before you know it, you're 3 tangents deep and people are mentally checked out. The solution? Internal signposting. Verbal markers that help people track where you are within a given topic. These don't need to be clunky. You're not writing an academic paper. But phrases like, here's the thing though, or, but before we can solve that, or, which brings us to the real question. These act as navigational cues. They signal transitions. They help people reset their attention. Think of them like chapter breaks in a book, but at a much finer grain. Every few sentences, you're subtly telling people, we're shifting gears now. And there's one more layer to this that's often overlooked, the power of callbacks. This is when you reference something you said earlier and show how the current point connects back to it. Remember what we said about acquisition costs rising? This is where that becomes critical. That kind of backward reference does two things. First, it rewards people who've been paying attention. They get the satisfaction of seeing connections form. Second, it reinforces the overall structure. It reminds everyone that this isn't a random collection of thoughts. It's a unified argument where pieces build on each other. Here's why all of this matters even more in remote settings. When you're in a physical room, if someone gets lost, they can pick up on social cues. They can see other people nodding or leaning in, and that helps them recalibrate. But on a video call, everyone's in their own isolated bubble. If they lose the thread, there's nothing pulling them back. They just drift. Email, Slack, mental grocery lists, whatever. But structure is a lifeline. It gives them multiple points of re-entry, even if they zone out for 30 seconds. When they tune back in and hear you say, "So that's the second reason this matters," they can reorient themselves. They know there's a first reason they missed and a third reason coming. They're not completely lost. So here's the tactical takeaway. Before any important meeting or presentation, spend 5 minutes mapping your structure, not writing a script, just outlining the bones. What are the 3 to 5 main points? What's the logical flow between them? What's the one-sentence connection that explains why point 2 follows point 1? Write that down. Not for them, for you. Because when you've internalized the structure, it becomes invisible. You don't sound like you're reading from an outline. You sound like someone who simply knows where they're going. And that confidence is what people read as authority. The question that changes everything. There's a particular kind of leader who dominates remote meetings. You know the type. They talk for 10 straight minutes. Slides advance. Data gets shared. Points get made. And by the end, everyone's exhausted and no one's actually engaged. These leaders confuse broadcasting with communication. They think their job is to transfer information from their brain into everyone else's. And technically, sure, that's happening. But nothing's sticking. Nothing's being internalized. Because human beings don't learn by being lectured at. We learn by being pulled into active thinking. This is the third skill, and it's possibly the most transformative. Strategic questioning. Not the performative kind, where you ask questions you already know the answer to, just to seem collaborative. Not rhetorical questions that are really just statements with question marks, but real questions. The kind that create genuine cognitive work for the people on the other end. The kind that force people to stop being passive recipients and start being active participants. Here's the shift you need to make. Stop thinking of yourself as the person with all the answers. Start thinking of yourself as the person who asks the questions that unlock everyone else's thinking. Because when you ask a truly good question, one that doesn't have an obvious answer, one that requires real thought, something powerful happens. People lean in. Their brains wake up. The meeting stops being something that's happening to them and becomes something they're part of. But most people are terrible at this. They ask questions that are too broad or too vague. What does everyone think? Silence. Or they ask questions that are thinly veiled prompts for agreement. Don't we all think this is the right approach? Also silence, but now with awkwardness. The problem with these questions isn't that they're bad in theory. It's that they don't create a clear pathway for response. People don't know what kind of thinking is being asked of them. Great questions are specific. They focus attention on a particular aspect of the problem. Instead of, "What do you think about this strategy?" Try, "If we implement this strategy, what's the first place you'd expect to see resistance?" See the difference? The second question is targeted. It asks people to think about a concrete scenario. It gives them a framework for their response. And because it's not asking for generic opinions, people feel safer contributing. They're not being asked to judge the entire strategy. They're just being asked to predict one specific thing. Here's another example. You're reviewing quarterly results, and the numbers are disappointing. The weak question is, why do you think we missed our targets? That sounds reasonable, but it's actually too open-ended. Everyone knows there are a million reasons. So people either give surface-level answers, or they don't say anything at all, because they don't want to point fingers. Now try this instead. Looking at these numbers, what's one assumption we made at the beginning of the quarter that turned out to be wrong? That question does three things. First, it's specific. You're asking about assumptions, not everything. Second, it's bounded. Just one, not a full post-mortem. Third, It removes blame from the equation. You're not asking who screwed up. You're asking what we collectively believed that didn't pan out. And that makes it psychologically safe to respond. People start talking. Real conversations begin. But strategic questioning isn't just about facilitating discussion. It's also about shaping how people think. The questions you ask determine the areas where people direct their attention. And if you're intentional about this, you can guide a group toward insights without having to spell everything out. This is one of the most sophisticated forms of leadership. You're not giving orders. You're creating the conditions under which people arrive at the right conclusions themselves. Let's say you're worried that your team is focusing too much on short-term wins at the expense of long-term strategy. You could just tell them that. Hey everyone, we need to think more long-term. But that's likely to trigger defensiveness. People will mentally list all the reasons they are thinking long-term. Instead, ask, if we execute perfectly on everything we're planning right now, where will we be in 3 years? Let them walk through it. Let them realize that the answer is basically the same place, just slightly bigger. And then ask, is that where we want to be? You haven't told them they're wrong. You've helped them see it for themselves. This is what Socratic method is really about, by the way. It's not about being coy or withholding knowledge. It's about recognizing that insights generated internally are far more powerful than insights received externally. When someone tells you something, you might remember it. When you figure it out yourself through good questions, you own it. It becomes part of how you think. And here's where this becomes especially powerful in remote settings. One of the biggest challenges of virtual meetings is the lack of real-time feedback. In person, you can see when someone's confused or checked out. You can adjust on the fly. But on a video call, people's faces are small and often static. You're flying blind. Strategic questions solve this. They're diagnostic tools. When you ask a specific question and get thoughtful responses, you know people are tracking. When you get silence or superficial answers, you know you need to recalibrate. So use questions as check-ins throughout your presentation. Not does everyone understand? No one's going to say no to that. But things like, before I go further, what questions does this raise for you? Or, what's one thing that surprises you about what I just shared? These aren't tests. They're genuinely curious inquiries that give people permission to surface confusion or disagreement early, before it compounds. There's also immense power in the follow-up question. Most people ask one question, get an answer, and move on. But the real insight often lives one level deeper. Someone gives you a surface response, and instead of accepting it, you gently probe. That's interesting. Can you say more about why you think that? Or, what makes that the most important factor in your mind? This isn't interrogation. It's invitation. You're showing that you genuinely want to understand their thinking. And that models the kind of depth you want from everyone. One final note on this. The best questions often aren't actually questions. They're prompts. Walk me through how you'd approach this, or help me understand what you're seeing that I might be missing. These are technically requests, but they function the same way. They pull people into active engagement. They shift the dynamic from monologue to dialogue. And in that shift, authority transforms. You're no longer the person who has to have all the answers. You become the person who knows how to unlock everyone else's best thinking. And in remote environments, where true collaboration is hard to come by, that's the kind of authority that actually matters. The discipline of listening at scale. You're in a meeting with 12 people. Someone's talking. And you, as the leader, are doing what leaders do. You're thinking ahead, planning your response, considering how this fits into the bigger picture, maybe glancing at your notes to see what point you wanted to make next. You're cognitively engaged. You're working hard, and yet, you're not actually listening. This is the paradox at the heart of remote leadership. Everyone talks about the importance of listening. It's corporate wisdom 101. But almost no one talks about how brutally difficult real listening becomes when you're managing a virtual room of people you can barely see, with audio that cuts in and out, while your own brain is running at full speed trying to steer the conversation. So what happens? We fake it. We nod at the camera. We say at appropriate intervals. We wait for people to stop talking so we can talk. And we call that listening. But here's what we're missing. True listening. The kind that makes people feel genuinely heard and understood. Isn't passive absorption. It's active interpretation. And in remote settings, where all the normal feedback mechanisms are broken, listening becomes a skill that requires deliberate practice and specific techniques. This is the fourth skill, and it might be the hardest one to master, because it requires you to quiet your own mental noise long enough to fully receive what someone else is saying. Let's start with why this is so critical for authority. There's a common misconception that authority comes from speaking well, from having good answers, from being the smartest person in the room. But anyone who's worked with truly effective leaders knows that's not quite right. Authority comes from being the person others trust. And trust is built through being seen and understood. When someone talks and you really listen, not just hear but synthesize and reflect back what they mean, they feel that. They feel valued. And that feeling translates into respect and influence, far more than any brilliant monologue ever could. But in a remote meeting with multiple participants, traditional listening breaks down. You can't make eye contact with everyone. You can't use body language to show engagement. Half the time, you're not even sure if someone's done talking or if they just paused to think. So you need a new approach. You need to make listening visible. And that happens through a practice called active synthesis. Here's how it works. Someone speaks. Instead of immediately responding with your own point, you first demonstrate that you've absorbed what they said, not by parroting it back word for word, that feels patronizing, but by restating the core idea in a way that shows you've processed it. So, if I'm hearing you right, you're concerned that this timeline doesn't account for the dependencies in the development cycle. Is that the heart of it? Notice what that does. It confirms understanding. It gives the speaker a chance to clarify if you got it wrong. And most importantly, it signals to everyone else on the call that their contributions will be taken seriously, that they won't just disappear into the void. This is crucial in remote settings where people often feel like they're shouting into a vacuum. When you make listening audible through synthesis, you're creating psychological safety. You're showing that participation is worth the effort. But synthesis isn't just for the speaker's benefit. It's also for everyone else. In a virtual meeting, not everyone can hear perfectly. Audio issues happen. People get distracted. Someone might have zoned out for 15 seconds right when a key point was made. When you synthesize, you're doing double duty. You're confirming understanding with the speaker, and you're also reinforcing the idea for anyone who might have missed it. You're functioning as both a listener and a translator. Here's where this gets sophisticated. As you get better at synthesis, you start doing something more powerful. You start connecting dots between what different people are saying. Someone makes a point about customer feedback. 5 minutes later, someone else mentions engineering constraints. Most people would treat these as separate topics, but a great listener catches the thread. You know, I'm struck by the connection between what Sarah said about customer needs and what James just mentioned about technical limitations. It sounds like we're facing a core trade-off between speed and customization. That kind of connective listening does something magical. It elevates the conversation. It shows people that their individual contributions are being woven into a larger tapestry. And it positions you not as the person with all the answers, but as the person who can see patterns that others miss. That's a different kind of authority. It's not dominance, it's perspective. And in remote meetings where everyone's field of view is limited to their own small screen, the person who can hold the big picture becomes invaluable. But let's be honest about the challenge here. Real listening is exhausting. Your brain wants to multitask. It wants to formulate responses while others are talking. It wants to check that Slack notification. And in a remote setting, it's so easy to do that. No one can see your other tabs. No one knows if you're really focused or just performing focus. So discipline becomes essential. Not moral discipline, cognitive discipline. You have to actively choose, moment by moment, to stay present. One technique that helps: physical anchoring. This sounds simple, but it works. When someone's talking, do something with your body that keeps you locked in. Maybe it's taking notes, not mindless transcription, but capturing key phrases and questions that arise. Maybe it's positioning your hands in a way that signals attention to yourself. Hands clasped or resting on your desk. The physical act becomes a commitment device. It's harder to drift when your body is engaged. Another technique, the question pause. When someone finishes talking, resist the urge to immediately respond. Count to 2. Use that space to actually process what they said. Ask yourself, what was the core claim? What emotion was underneath it? What question would help me understand their thinking better? That 2-second pause does 2 things. It ensures you're responding to what they actually said, not what you expected them to say. And it signals respect. You're showing that their words deserve consideration, not just reaction. Here's a subtle but crucial point. Listening isn't just about understanding content. It's about reading context. In person, you'd pick up on tone, body language, group dynamics. Online, you have to work harder. Pay attention to who's speaking and who's silent. Notice when someone tries to jump in but gets talked over. Watch for the person who's nodding vigorously but not unmuting. These are data points. They tell you about the actual conversation happening beneath the surface conversation. And sometimes, the best listening is proactive. If you notice someone's been quiet, create space for them. Not by putting them on the spot awkwardly, but by opening a door. I'm curious if anyone who hasn't spoken yet has thoughts on this. Or even more directly but gently. Marcus, I saw you nodding earlier. I'd love to hear what you're thinking. That kind of active inclusion is a form of listening. You're listening to the silence. You're attending to absence as much as presence. There's one more dimension to this that separates good listeners from exceptional ones. Listening for what's not being said. This is advanced. But in any meeting, there are topics people are dancing around. Concerns they're hinting at, but not stating directly. Disagreements they're softening. And if you're only listening to the words, you'll miss it. But if you're listening to patterns, the way someone keeps circling back to the same issue, or the way the energy shifts when a particular topic comes up, you can surface those hidden dynamics. This might sound like, I notice we keep coming back to the question of budget. I'm wondering if there's a deeper concern here about resource allocation that we should address directly. You're not claiming to read minds. You're making an observation about the conversation itself. And often, that's the invitation people need to say what they've been holding back. Here's the bottom line. In remote meetings, where physical presence is diminished and attention is fragmented, listening becomes your superpower. Not because it's rare, though it is, but because it fundamentally changes the nature of the interaction. When people feel truly heard, they engage differently. They think more deeply. They trust more readily. And they follow more willingly. Not because you've convinced them with arguments, but because you've created the conditions for real collective thinking. And that's what authority actually looks like in a virtual environment. It's not about commanding the room. It's about conducting the symphony, making sure every voice is heard, every idea is considered, and every contribution is woven into something larger than any individual could create alone. We started this journey with a question. Why do some leaders show up on camera and immediately command attention, while others struggle to hold presence? And what we've discovered is that it's not about charisma. It's not about having a better camera or a more impressive background. It's about mastering 4 very specific, very learnable skills that transform how people experience you in virtual spaces. The power of the pause. Understanding that silence isn't empty. It's the container that gives your words weight. Learning to resist the urge to fill every second with sound. And instead trusting that strategic quiet creates space for real processing, real reflection, and real engagement. The structure beneath the surface. Recognizing that in environments where attention is scarce and distractions are endless, people need clear frameworks to hold on to. Building invisible architecture into everything you say, so that even when people drift, they can find their way back. Connecting ideas not just sequentially, but causally. Showing how each piece fits into a larger, coherent argument. The question that changes everything. Shifting from broadcasting mode to invitation mode. Understanding that the mark of true leadership isn't having all the answers, but asking the questions that unlock everyone else's best thinking. Learning to design questions that are specific enough to be actionable, but open enough to generate genuine insight, and the discipline of listening at scale. Making the invisible work of attention audible through synthesis and connection. Fighting against every instinct to formulate your response while others are talking, and instead fully receiving what's being offered. Listening not just to words, but to patterns, to silences, to the shape of the conversation itself. These skills compound. When you pause, you create space. When you structure, you give that space meaning. When you question, you activate that space. And when you listen, you honor what emerges in that space. Together they form a system, a way of being in virtual rooms that feels fundamentally different from the rushed, surface-level exchanges that dominate most remote meetings. But here's what I want you to understand. This isn't about performing authority. It's about earning it. There's a version of leadership that's all theater. The right words, the right tone, the right props. And sure, that might work for a while, but it's exhausting, and people eventually see through it. What we're talking about here is something deeper. It's about becoming the kind of leader people actually want to follow. Not because you've mastered some tricks, but because you've developed the capacity to create space for others to think, to be heard, and to contribute meaningfully. And the beautiful thing about these skills is that they make meetings better for everyone. When you pause, conversations become less rushed and more thoughtful. When you structure, people feel less lost and more engaged. When you question strategically, dialogue replaces monologue. When you listen actively, people feel valued. So you're not just improving your own presence. You're upgrading the quality of every interaction you're part of. I think about the remote meetings I've been in that actually felt alive. The ones where time passed quickly because everyone was engaged. Where ideas built on each other in real time. Where people left energized rather than drained. And without exception, those meetings were led by someone who understood these principles. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but deliberately. Someone who saw their role not as the star of the show, but as the curator of the collective intelligence in the room. That's what's possible when you take these skills seriously. When you stop treating remote meetings as a lesser version of in-person interaction and start seeing them as their own medium with their own rules and their own potential. Yes, something is lost when we're not in the same physical space, but something can also be gained. The person who would never speak up in a boardroom might unmute themselves on a video call. The ideas that would get drowned out by whoever talks loudest in person might actually get heard when there's intentional structure. The quick conversations that would happen in hallways can be replaced by something more deliberate, more inclusive, more thoughtful. But only if we learn to lead differently. Only if we let go of the old playbook and write a new one. So here's my invitation. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't tell yourself you'll work on this once you've got everything else figured out. Start tomorrow, in your very next meeting. Pick one skill. Maybe it's the pause. Try stopping after your next important statement and counting to 3 before moving on. Feel how uncomfortable it is. Notice what happens in that space. Or maybe it's questioning. Instead of explaining your position, ask one genuinely curious question and see what emerges. You don't have to transform overnight. These skills develop with practice, but the trajectory changes immediately. The moment you start paying attention to how you show up in virtual spaces. The moment you stop seeing remote meetings as something to get through and start seeing them as opportunities to lead with intention, that's when everything shifts. Because the smartest communicators aren't those who speak the most. They're the ones who listen fast, think clear, and speak with purpose, who understand that authority in the digital age isn't about volume. It's about presence, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that invites, not the kind that tells, but the kind that asks, not the kind that fills every space, but the kind that creates it. That's the leader people remember. That's the voice that cuts through the noise. And that's who you can become. One pause, one structure, one question, one moment of real listening at a time. If this resonated with you, think about one meeting coming up where you could apply these principles. Just one. See what happens when you show up differently. And if you found value in this, share it with someone who's navigating the same challenges. Because we're all learning how to lead in this strange new world together.